What's up, everybody? Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we are building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. Before we get started, I want to give big shout-outs to Eileen in Oakland, Grace in Brooklyn, and Shira in the Bronx for signing up for monthly subscriptions at the movement builder level. Convergence Magazine is an independent publication that relies on the generosity of readers and listeners just like them to create the rigorous and thoughtful takes that you've come to expect from us week in and week out. You can join them by becoming a subscriber at convergencemag.com/donate. Any amount helps, either as a one-time donation or a recurring monthly or annual subscription. This week on the show, I'm first joined by journalist and friend of the pod, Sarah Lazar, discussing her new article this week in The Nation, covering how American healthcare workers are defending their transgender patients from Trump's executive order attacks. Then for our main segment, I'm joined by Executive Director of Mijente, Marisa Franco. We've got a lot to talk about, responding to conditions right now for immigrants while building power in immigrant communities, and how corporate surveillance from big tech has transformed the way immigration enforcement works. But first, these headlines, the central theme of which seems to be that the cracks are showing. Last week, Congress was on recess, which led to some pretty spectacular moments in town halls, constituents bringing their outrage directly to their lawmakers, including one in Kootenai County, Idaho, where a woman speaking up was forcibly removed by unidentified men in plainclothes who refused to identify themselves. When she was removed from the event, local police showed up, unclear about who these men were or who they were even working for. It turns out that they were working for a private security firm, although they were at the town hall with the county sheriff, who has previously gone viral for MAGA theatrics at the local library. Sheriff Norris later claimed to the Coeur d'Alene Post-False Press that he did not know who hired them or why they were there. The security firm in question is Lear Asset Management. They have a history of passing themselves off as law enforcement and being used against protesters both in Idaho and also here in Northern California. As to when and why they began operating in Idaho, that's still a little unclear. But what is interesting to me about all of this is there appears to be a divide between the Coeur d'Alene police chief, who recently also revoked Lear's license to operate in the city, and County Sheriff Norris, who clearly is fully MAGA-pilled. Experts on civil resistance to authoritarianism have pointed out that police and the military are crucial to upholding an authoritarian regime. And while the police are definitely not our friends, this points to potentially exploitable cracks in the edifice. MAGA has less power than they're trying to project, and even the cops sometimes aren't on board. We were also delighted to see Maine's governor, Janet Mills, going toe-to-toe with Trump, to his face, over the administration's gender policing executive order.
The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way, that's good, but I understand Maine, is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it? We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding. See you in court. Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
So the backstory here is there's a student athlete who was outed by a MAGA state rep on social media, and the governor and Democratic lawmakers stood by state law and policies, which include protections against discrimination based on gender identity and expression. So when Trump calls her out in this meeting with governors at the White House last Friday, she stood up to his threats. And we need to see more of this kind of standing up to Trump, including to his face, from people who are in positions of power. Finally, funny might be the wrong word to use here, but as a person who is a Catholic in recovery, I find it pretty amusing that 2019 convert and self-proclaimed, quote, baby Catholic J.D. Vance has been finding himself tangling with the Pope about what Catholic teaching actually means. Backhanded comments from Vance at a national prayer breakfast this morning attempted to credit Pope Francis's leadership while also still refusing to back down from the draconian MAGA deportation policies, which the Pope explicitly named and shamed Vance about 2 weeks ago. Vance claimed this morning that he wasn't there to litigate about, quote, who's right and who's wrong. The point of disagreement is that the 88-year-old pontiff has been critical of the MAGA immigration crackdown and also specifically of Vance's deployment of niche Catholic writings, often weaponized by white supremacists to justify it. By the way, the Pope is in the hospital with pneumonia. Apparently, Vance and his family are, quote, praying for him every day while all this has been playing out. There is another lesson here, and it's that it turns out you can fight back from many places, including a hospital bed. Another thing that experts on authoritarianism tell us is that faith communities have a huge role to play in mounting the civil resistance, and I hope to see more faith leaders call out the cruelty, hypocrisy, and bad faith bullshit from the MAGA cultists in the weeks to come. Now I'm joined by writer for The Nation, Sarah Lazar. Her latest piece this week for The Nation covers the way that healthcare workers are defending their trans patients from the attacks of Trump's executive orders. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us to talk about your piece.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's give a little context for this story. What were you hearing about that led you to pursue it? How did it kind of take shape?
It really took shape because I went to a protest here in Chicago where I live against UI Health amid reports that they had paused some of their gender affirming care. And when I got there, I was really struck by how many workers and unions were there. The graduate employees organization was there. SEIU 73 was there. And I started talking with organizers and I asked, are there healthcare workers at their hospitals who are mobilizing to defend their transgender patients? And then through movement networks, I was able to find those people. And part of why I was so curious is because, we've seen examples of hospital administrations complying in advance, maximally complying with Trump edicts. Not everywhere, in some cases, but not all cases. And the fact that it's not in all cases shows that it is possible to not maximally comply. But a question I had is, as administrations do this, how do their workers feel about it? Workers who often have close relationships with their patients, who maybe got into this work because they believe in the basic rights and dignity of trans youth and gender diverse youth. How do they respond to this moment? And I was able to find some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you talked to healthcare workers, not just in states that are notoriously bad on trans rights, but also healthcare workers, like you said, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, that this is like not just it's like uneven, even according to sort of like state policy and the like political atmosphere in particular places that this is playing out.
Well, 24 states had, even before Trump's flurry of executive orders, had some kind of ban on gender affirming care for transgender youth. And then, that meant that places like Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago were a place that people could cross state lines to go to get healthcare for their kids. Also places like Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. So then when you start seeing Lurie, for example, pausing surgeries, it generated a lot of concern because these are the safe havens, these are the places where people go. It's also, there's also a certain lack of transparency. Some of what I tried to do in this piece was just report out what exactly is going on. Because you don't want to overstate it, right? Like you don't want to overstate the issue because it's a really upsetting, scary time for youth and their families, and you don't want to like unnecessarily terrify people. But you do want to accurately capture the picture. And I think some of what I found out is that when there's confusion and lack of transparency, that in itself can lead to delays or appointments getting canceled. And as long as appointments aren't happening people aren't getting the care they need. So another goal was just sort of clarity.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And like one of the things that did stick out to me about that too is just how it can be very hard to get information, like actual information about what's going on right now because of, I mean, part of it is like privacy laws, but then part of it is, I imagine a lot of these hospital administrators don't want to be seen as maximally complying with the administration. So that seems like a complicated place.
Yeah, yeah. And, so one of the people I talked to is an organizer with California Nurses Association, which is part of National Nurses United, which is the biggest union of RNs in the country. And that individual is organizing at Kaiser Permanente in San Francisco and South San Francisco with the ultimate goal of winning sanctuary hospitals throughout the Kaiser system. Sanctuary both for transgender and gender diverse youth, but then also for immigrants and people who are targeted by Trump's escalated crackdown. And that person told me that, one of the unnerving things is that, Kaiser to this point has not indicated that it plans to comply, but that individual is also worried that if they did comply, they wouldn't even find out, or that the only way they would find out is through the parents of trans kids.
Sure. Yeah.
So
I also have...
Oh, sorry. That's why they were trying to sort of take proactive action in advance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I also have to ask you what it was like to report this, because I imagine a lot of the healthcare workers that you talk to are feeling pretty antsy about the political environment and are very aware of the potential risks that they're taking related to speaking out about this.
There was definitely a good amount of concern about protecting privacy. I did notice a pattern where people who are mobilizing with their unions as part of their unions were more comfortable going on the record. It was a little mixed. Like sometimes they would go on the record but didn't want their hospital's name in the piece because that could lead to retaliation. But then I also talked to people who work for clinics that are relying on federal funding, and they didn't even want me to say what city or even what part of the country they're in, or really anything at all that was identifiable. And it's really understanding. I mean, it's an intense climate. And I think also people are feeling very protective of the services that they do provide. They just don't want to jeopardize them in any way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing this reporting with us, Sarah, and talking a little bit about the story. We will have the link to the full story in the show notes. I think it's really important to highlight the ways in which, especially organized labor, can play a role in fighting back against some of this stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, take care.
You too.
All right. The Trump administration is still moving forward with its ambitious and cruel plans of mass deportations. And it's sort of been slipping from the headlines a little bit in favor of the bureaucratic chaos that's being created by Elon Musk and Doge. But the threat is no less serious today than when Trump and Vance campaigned on extremely racist demands for more mass deportations of millions of undocumented immigrants from the United States. Mijente is a political organizing home for Latinx and Chicanx communities to build power without, against, and within the state. Joining me to discuss what's going on and also help us understand the work that's being done to defend immigrant communities across the country is Executive Director of Mijente, Marisa Franco. Marisa, thank you so much for making the time to join me today. I'm sure you are very busy right now.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you, Kaden.
Yeah, likewise.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been a long time. But, I've been keeping track of all the stuff that you all are working on, and I have a lot of admiration for the vision that you've been able to hold at Mijente for all these years. And I think that one of the places I wanted to start is also talking about the long-term organizing approach that you all have taken over the past several years and how it's prepared you for this moment. Because I know that you and I have been in conversations about the surge in white nationalist organizing, insurgent authoritarian organizing. I mean, for a very long time, probably, I mean, I would say like a decade is probably ago is probably when we first met, specifically in rooms talking about this question. So, yeah, could you give our listeners a little overview of the long-term organizing approach that you all are taking?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So Mijente actually turns 10 this year, and so we started in 2015. I think it's an important marker because the same time that we started was the same year that Donald Trump famously descended from his golden escalator in Trump Towers. And we were coming out of the people that started Mijente, like the kind of founding crew had previously like worked together fighting deportations in the Obama administration. That led to different policies, trying to stop deportations. And one of the things coming out of that period obviously continued, but campaigns start in. But one of the things that for me was like a big reflection was clocking the political, cultural and demographic and social change in the United States would produce a backlash. So 2015, if we think back, it's, you have marriage equality enacted not too long before. Mm-hmm. You have a insurgent movement asserting the right to Black life and calling out police brutality and police murder of Black people. You have, it's on the tail of pretty unprecedented organizing by undocumented people, undocumented youth who fought and ultimately won DACA, undocumented workers, undocumented adults fighting deportations. But also in 2015, a couple of statistics from the Pew Research Center. It was the year that the middle class in the United States was no longer the biggest sort of economic class. Mm-hmm. You had millennials surpass boomers in terms of population. It marked, over the last 50 years, marked 59 million immigrants had come into the United States. Multiracial people identify as multiracial were the fastest growing population. And you had record numbers in the lowest, like record breaking on the low end of people's trust in government, which has been a strategy of the right for decades. And so, you take all of this, right? And following the Romney loss, the Republicans famously conducted a postmortem where one of the takeaways was like, y'all got to get it together. You gotta, bring in different people into your coalition. Y'all a little too racist, what. And, Trump basically bucked all of that.
Right.
So a lot of the conversations, strategizing, sort of assessing after the loss of Romney, I read this article in The Economist many, many years ago. It was like one of the things that was one of my brain tanks when you were trying to think of Mijente. There was this sort of debate inside of, whoever it is that you consider the Economist, people that follow The Economist are. And I don't know if it was in the article or if I ended up kind of naming it that, but there was a group that was like the assimilationists, which kind of more prescribed or believed in sort of the assessment of like, we need to figure out how to reach to other audiences, kind of come more to the center. But it was also like looking at, like the United States is changing. We need to acknowledge that. We need to bring other people into the coalition and sort of convince them into like the American project as we see it. And then there was like the annihilationists who basically were like, fuck that. And so Trump, really embodied that faction and ultimately won and broke the Republican Party. So today when people are like, Republicans did this strategy, it was so brilliant. No, it wasn't. Someone came in and beat their ass repeatedly and completely changed the party. Which kind of, we could get into what needs to happen with the Democratic Party, but maybe a little later. So Mijente, I think, comes out of an assessment that, demographic change is happening in this country. And for many years, there'd been this demographics is destiny and like this new emerging progressive new American majority. In our estimation, like I'm a Chicana, my father is an immigrant from Mexico. I'm from Arizona. And I look around and understand my family, and I think many other Latinx folks could confer. Not so sure that Latinos will be this automatic progressive majority. We have to organize them. And also reflecting on the lessons of the immigrant rights movement, tremendous organizing done by undocumented people, bravery, leadership, paving ground, winning shit, stopping deportations, and ultimately not getting to where we needed to go. And, you know, the immigrant rights movement had for so long contorted itself to convince white Americans why you should want immigrants. You know, we'll grow your food, we're workers, we're this, we're that. And, you know, to me, there was this real blind spot with US born people of color, of which some of my family would be part of that. And oftentimes being completely left out. And the primary issue not being documentation status, but just being working class in the United States in a time where shit's not looking good. And so, you know, Mijente comes out of this, like, we need to build broader political power to continue to fight for immigrant justice. But we also need political organization for Latinx people who this isn't working. The math ain't mathing. And we need a left political formation inside the Latino community. So we were trying to address gaps, both in organizing infrastructure, but political imagination, political platform. And so we set off to do that. And I think, you know, emblematically in 2015, when all of this is happening, and in many ways, you know, at the time we talked about, you know, the coming backlash. And I think the only thing that has surprised me, because I think it did obviously happen, what surprised me in the end was how quickly it has happened.
Yeah. I think the speed of a lot of this is like a little bit, it's definitely kind of mind boggling. And the threads that I want to pull on a little bit are, I think, this like cultural piece that you're talking about. And I also remember, I mean, back in 2015, I was in charge of an Asian American racial justice organizing group. So, and I think that we've seen, there's so many parallels, I think. At that time, you know, in the Asian American community, we were talking a lot about how there was this hard left swing amongst Asian Americans that used to be like half a generation prior, like really in like late 90s, like early 2000s, like the Asian American community was very split in a partisan way, right? And that like in the Obama years, it seemed that most Asian American communities had fully joined the sort of Democratic coalition. And like, there was a feeling, I think, at the time that like even if demographics weren't destiny, that like things were going in the right direction, right? That like the coalition was going to be real. But I think that looking especially on the past, like looking back on especially the past 5 years and the stuff that's been happening, I would argue in some ways culturally, because like it's like even like crime statistics don't bear out the like way that people feel like they're in greater danger now than they ever have been, but that like this cultural piece that informs our politics is so undertended and has been undertended. And that I think that like what I hear you talking about is like the role of political homes for people is both developing a political consciousness and analysis amongst people, but also building a culture, right? Like a culture of engagement with and asking questions about mainstream discourse that I think is really, it's really vital and really important. And I guess the other thread to pull on maybe is this thing about how, like Trump also represents in a lot of ways, like a cultural shift for the Republican Party. And that part of like the rupture that he created was one that wasn't necessarily just about policy, but it was about attitude. It was about like how they show up in certain spaces that, you know, I think that I would argue are building on a lot of what the sort of like right-wing think tank, like media machine has been trying to do for the past 40 years, but that like is a significant acceleration maybe. I just realized none of this is a question, but I'm curious. We're just wrapping. I just want to dig deeper into this like cultural piece and the work of building a political home, especially like in this time when like the internet has also changed the way that we are social with each other in such a profound way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've always struggled with inside of Mijente is like, should we be like going super mass? Like, there's over 65 million Latinos in the United States, obviously very, very diverse in all respects. Should we trying to talk to them? Should we trying to get at like sort of the folks that are in the fight but disparate and scattered and don't feel like they have a place where they can come back and sort of take it, sit down and sort of like, take all the change out of the pocket and figure out how do I keep going, like political home for organizers and activists? Or is it like going to the DC sort of political places and trying to influence Latinos fighting battles in those types of spaces? And, you know, it, we've often just kind of been in the middle one because it was like, well, that's where there's actually people building organization, building base. And that's felt like the most kind of like, we need to build a foundation of people, like it's sort of a founding membership that understands like this wasn't a Latino project for the sake of the sort of traditional idea of ascendance that I think in non-Black organizations of color has often been sort of quietly anti-Black, because the story that we don't say is like in Latino community, how you make it is a piece of like, keep your head down and just work hard and kind of, work out and to distance yourself as much as possible from indigeneity and Blackness. And so we wanted to build we wanted to build a type of organization that didn't subscribe to that notion, right? And that it didn't just sort of see itself as just for Latinos, but actually we're trying to like gather our people to show up to the broader thing with something to offer to the party, right? And so that's been hard, to figure out which way to go, and that will be something to reflect on. But in terms of the cultural stuff that you're talking about, I don't think that's just a Latino question or it's across the board, and I would say broadly, it is a heightened sense of alienation and loneliness, and sort of and that's more social and here. And then there's like a downturn where I think people look around and they don't necessarily think that their future looks brighter, or that who's coming, like, I don't know what my kid's gonna face.
Yeah.
And so the fact of the matter is that is true. People feel that. And Donald Trump's campaign over the last 12 years has been offering a story as to why that is, who's at fault, and what am I going to do to solve it. And so he has sold people a bag of goods that ultimately says it's an immigrant person who is making your rent high, who's taking your job, who's making you feel unsafe, and not the billionaire class. And I don't know that. I think we could spend a lot of time talking about, well, why is that or what? But I think the piece to underscore here is that I don't think the Democratic Party has offered anything that remotely competes with the narrative of providing answers, because they have been unwilling to defy their donors and defy the parts of like the defense of capital and power and the status quo. They have been unwilling to do it. And so we're literally sitting here analyzing why we all got our ass kicked, and the Democratic Party can't seem to bring itself to even look in the mirror a little bit to acknowledge that piece, and instead have then doubled down on blaming now, the woke or the this or the that.
Yeah.
Everybody has some soul searching and looking in the mirror. Like, no one's gonna say that, but that cultural piece, I think is huge. I think it's huge, but it's connected to something. It's connected to a reality, and similar to the way that the inner circle of President Biden sort of refused to acknowledge there was millions of people like, I'm not sure about this. They're refusing to acknowledge that piece, and refusing to acknowledge like, well, why is it that there was so many supporters of Bernie Sanders who then ended up being Trump supporters? It's because they're tired of the same shit and they want to see something different, and they're kind of willing to let things break. Now we're kind of seeing like, oh shit, yeah, it's really messed up. Oh shit, what are we gonna do? But like, that's where people were at. And
Yeah.
so
Turns out there's a degree of breaking that is actually just not acceptable to the majority of people.
mhm, yeah. But there's something there where like I just thought it was really fascinating, um, where there was like the posture coming out of the Biden and the Harris campaign was this preservation of the status quo. And I just think they missed the memo that like the status quo isn't working for people.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not like I can accept that, like, well, Marisa, you're on the left, and that's not what people want. Like, fine, but like, you ain't gonna tell me that people are like, increasingly tired of things just kind of staying the same and are not really feeling the like E for effort anymore. And I think the Democratic brand has been one where people are like looking around, like they might not agree with everything Trump says, but I think they believe him when he says he's going to do something and he's going to try.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think with the Democrats, it's like, I don't know what you're about, and I don't actually trust that you're really going to try. You're just kind of giving me a bag of goods that, once the election ends, you want everything to go back in cruise control.
Sure. Yeah, I think that like it's a sort of, I mean, again, it's like I keep saying things are funny and I don't mean that they're funny haha. But they're funny weird. That like kind of the part of the reason I think so many of the cracks are showing right now is the like front and center way in which Elon Musk in particular, but also like the tech billionaires generally have kind of lined up around Trump in this administration versus the last one, and that like that is also, I think, pressing a button for some of the same people that you describe. And I'm curious if you're like hearing this in like organizing conversations in your base, if like this is part of the calculus, is like thinking about the way in which like we live in an oligarchy, and we kind of always have, right? That like a little bit of the distrust of the Democratic Party is that they're like the smiling face of the oligarchy as opposed to like the violent cudgel of the oligarchy.
I mean, I remember like being like clocking that when Clinton ran against Trump, and it was like, how are people like? There was like this disdain that people had for Clinton, and yes, some of it is old-fashioned misogyny.
Yeah, definitely.
But like Trump is like a millionaire by the time he was like 5 years old, right? So how come there was like this like she was considered elite, but Trump wasn't.
Yeah.
And I think there is a piece that's just like we gotta, keep it a buck. Like a lot of our people aspire to be rich. They want to be successful. They want to feel like they have resources. And so they see Trump as somebody like there's a way where they almost relate to Trump more in this strange way, more so than a Hillary Clinton. And I think when you kind of look a little bit deeper, I think it's this sort of we know better than you. We know better than you. We are better than you. We're smarter than you. We say things the right way. That I think, and there's been this thing, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of this, of like the education gap, that's been talked about. And just like maybe perhaps like a level of resentment that grows from that, where people kind of feel like talked down to, looked down upon, that I think they just really successfully latched onto. And in particular with men, again, hard to pull apart which part is just good old-fashioned bad old-fashioned machismo and what's like some other stuff that's going on for people. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know, we're kind of just meandering
no
here,
it's interesting because it is like I think one of the through lines of a lot of conversations that we have on this show is the relationship between like culture and feeling, and then like what kinds of political action regular people are willing to take, and how important that actually is to the work of blocking authoritarianism and building a movement to win. Is that like we also can't wait for them to make the case for us, right? That like we need to be pretty clear about what is on offer, and that these things aren't simple.
Okay.
Yeah. Could you tell me a little bit about what your work has looked like since Inauguration Day? Are there are there shifts that y'all have been making? What is it that y'all have been working on in this immediate period?
Yeah. So obviously, given our origin, given the origin of Mijente, immigration has been a key issue that we've worked on. There, immigrants are a huge part of our base. So we obviously saw the writing on the wall. So just in case, for some of your listeners that might not be sort of immigration, I think is really confusing. It confuses me. um, and so a lot of like my crew is sometimes I was like, what's this again? So I'll just do like a little like this is kind of like big picture where it's been, and then some of the Trump stuff. So obviously Trump ran on a kind of moved from build a wall to mass deportations. So during Biden there was a lot of focus on the border and responding to asylum seekers, right, and what was happening at the border. Trump will sort of kind of double down on that and essentially, for all intents and purposes, end asylum as we know it. But then is that now going back in and kind of doubling down on interior enforcement. So you're seeing that, and inside of that, an expansion of like force multipliers. So when I speak in the next part about some of the like recent history of immigration enforcement, one of the things that they're always trying to figure out is they have a finite number of ICE agents, right? And it's definitely way less than the estimated number of folks in the country without status. And so they're constantly trying to figure out ways to multiply capacity. And what Trump is doing is, and so historically that's been done with police, local police. There's been a lot of organizing around that issue. They're now using, DEA, FBI, they're trying to get National Guard, ATF, IRS agents. They just trying to get everybody and be like, y'all, let's go. Looking to end all types of temporary status programs, so temporary protected status, looking to sort of end as much anything that gave people like different levels of relief, whether it was temporary or particular visas. They're looking to expand detention dramatically. Obviously, people have heard about the Guantanamo Bay, the use of military bases, dusting off detention centers that hadn't been used and building new ones. They're looking to expand expedited removal, which means they just deport people pretty immediately. And sort of while you've seen in an international context where Trump has sort of attempted to get people to bend the knee, I would say he's Joffrey, if we're using a Game of Thrones reference. But in terms of the, internationally, it's like the threat of tariffs. Domestically, it's the threat of cutting federal funding for everything, right? If you don't do this, I'm cutting funding. If you don't. And so they're trying to force state compliance in all different forms, not to mention all the EOs that they've done, which there's tons. So I can share resources if folks want more information. But looking at it, taking a step back, we're now going on almost 40 years since the last legalization in Congress, 40 years. Since the creation of DHS following September 11, 2001, almost over $409 billion have been spent on immigration enforcement compared to $11 billion for immigration courts, i.e. coming the right way or doing it the right way.
It's like such a huge gap in terms of the scale.
And then we talk about like when people actually, and this is going to dramatically increase, if not double, triple. So you're looking at a federal budget that cuts everything and is like military, immigration enforcement, police, Justice Department. And, there has been a lot of talk about criminal, the criminalization, criminals, what people have done. I think it's important to say, to understand that the cadre of people working inside of the Trump administration, while they may be saying they're going after criminals, the thing that we must understand is that for them, all immigrants are criminal, and they will not stop there. Anybody who is other is criminal to them. And so that's why, like, what's happening to immigrants today should be of concern to all of us, because they're not going to stop there. It is simply sort of, that's where they're starting and that's what they're experimenting on. But best believe that is not where they're going to end. That is not the end goal. So, all of that for us was like, you're looking at pretty much everything we've been able to win. Small things, right? Is being dismantled. And you're almost like 10, 15 years back with extra bad shit coming your way. So in a lot of ways, I think we're trying to understand how it is that they're working. A lot of our campaigns and advocacy and policy proposals over the last decade have come from studying and understanding how is it that immigration and customs enforcement is trying to identify, arrest, detain, prosecute, and deport our people. And so our task at hand now is to see how are they doing it now, and what are the new policy handles to be able to try to slow them down and reduce harm. We're still trying to figure that out, because they're literally undoing everything, and then just, there's a lot of new stuff that's happening at a breakneck speed. So in the meantime, the other side of it is like, kind of like, there's like what happens up until the point of arrest. And then there's post-arrest. Post-arrest is kind of like the Wild Wild West. That's where we know the least. That's where we know kind of like, that's where we're kind of trying to do our homework. So right now, prevention is our best hand.
Makes a lot of sense.
And so that's why you've seen an organic sort of springing up of Know Your Rights, organizing, community defense all across the country. And that's what we've tried to, leaned into in this time. As a national organization, how do we support our local crews that are doing this work face to face in communities? But then where are we filling gaps where there's not infrastructure, and so that means like it's canvassing, it's building new alliances from the bottom up with religious organizations, with schools, with local businesses. And you're seeing real resistance, there's stories from bus drivers to health officials, teachers, local business folks, local elected officials who are stepping out and, having this very like organic, it's making and at the end of the day, it just makes their job more difficult. So they're like throwing the kitchen sink. And the more that we fight, the more that we resist, the more that we buy ourselves time, and more we protect as many people as possible, because once they get arrested, right now they're moving at breakneck speed. So prevention and community defense that I think can be used for other forms of mutual aid is the name of the game right now.
That makes a lot of sense to me in terms of here are the points of intervention that are available. And also I think that it does also seem like there's something deeply advantageous about being able also then to have those things be visible in the community, wherever you are, that knowing that there are people out there who are ready to be in the way basically is something that I'm sure is helping other people see where they might be able to be useful, which feels big. In terms of one of the things that I think about a lot, and that because I'm also somebody who I just can't stop thinking about the internet and big tech and what we have done. But that I'm curious about this piece about how with so much of what the Trump administration is doing in terms of dismantling systems and the way that they've worked, and it seems like a lot of that is now being sort of basically outsourced to big business. Are there any emerging levers around that kind of stuff that you guys are keeping track of? And I think, obviously a lot of people are going after Elon Musk and are really mad for good reason about that. And going, even staging protests at Tesla dealerships, which I think is hilarious, frankly, that he has such a large sort of he's such a vulnerability to the public because his businesses are so public. But are there things like that y'all are thinking about and the kinds of businesses that are making it possible for the Trump administration to dismantle the way things have been.
Yeah, I would be remiss not to shout out Jacinta Gonzalez, who has led this work at Mijente for many years. So the No Tech for ICE campaign has been a campaign that, you know, has had different sort of chapters and targets, starting with Palantir, which is a corporate target we campaigned against for years. But, you know, when we talk about force multiplication, there is the deployment or sort of the entanglement with local police, now federal law enforcement agencies, but data and technology is the other way that it's happened. So that's kind of how the No Tech for ICE campaign came to be, because doing deportation defense, one of the things you're trying to learn is how is it that this person got picked up? And early on, what we were seeing is that they were being identified through search engines, through like contracts with private technology companies, data companies, then eventually going on to data brokers. And so that's been a lot of like the research that's been happening. And so I think, you know, and like just as like you have followed the tech industry, like I mean, it's a trip to think of like Elon Musk and where he was politically 4 years ago.
Yeah.
But the signs are there, the seeds are there inside of like the tech industry and like the tech barons and how they see themselves. You know, it's not super, it's like shocking but not surprising, you know, in terms of how you know, the tech sector and some of the leaders of that sector are falling. I mean, there's, you know, you have to, there's Elon Musk, but like the OG here is Peter Thiel.
Oh
in
yeah,
terms of
absolutely.
like, you know, but one thing I think we're really interested in, I can share resources of some of the research, but it's looking at the local level and what kind of contracts localities have with different private tech and data companies. So we've been doing a lot of research on LexisNexis, and are looking at, you know, there's like the traditional form of sanctuary that is obviously being talked about a lot, but, you know, thinking about digital sanctuary and what kind of, you know, trying to intervene on what data is collected and shared, and really kind of targeting at the local level and looking at that side of things, again, to create these barriers and sort of speed bumps for like the massive multiplication of capacity to identify, seek out, arrest, detain immigrants. And so the digital sanctuary piece, I think, is like the newest component. And so I can share some of the research and reports that we've been generating around that.
That's great. Yeah, I'm sure our listeners would be interested in learning more about that, because I think that it's like, I don't know. Part of it is like, obviously it's my personal axe to grind, as you know. But part of it is also, I just think that like, as a left, we need to be developing some real good analysis about like what is going on in this industry and why they've become so powerful. And I think rightly, as you say, a lot of it is like a lot of this like public-private partnership stuff where they're like kind of inserting themselves into law enforcement and local government, and it's chilling. I actually had a like, it's a memory of talking about digital sanctuary with you, like literally like 10 years ago, I think, just like popped into my brain. I was just like, oh, I feel like we've been talking about this for a while. It's unfortunate that it's coming back in this particular context, but it's that feels really important. The other thing I did want to ask you about is like, you know, when we're also thinking about the sort of like culture and origins of the authoritarian movement that we're up against is climate change, right? And the like impact that climate change has on both like, you know, I'm also the child of immigrants, are the places that our families are from. And then also, I think like when we think about the uneven effects of climate change on like working class people of color in this country, and like the things that are happening here, and you know, how do you all orient and are like, is this part of like the conversation that you're having also as we're like preparing for really the long haul of the next 4 years, right? The like this is going to be part of an intensifying experience that all of us have, right? Like regardless of race or class, but then also like the ways that it is shaping, I guess like our collective vulnerability also to people like Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can understand climate change is one of the sort of new kid on the block of push factors to migration. A good compañera who is part of the Siembra North Carolina team, which shout out to them. They've released this really dope guide called Defend and Recruit on some of these community defense tactics. But one of the things she told me years ago that I always hold on to is that one of the greatest protest to global imperialism is mass migration. And I think about that, and then it's like, can we do a sub point that's like the perils, like the sort of the consequence of imperialism and the climate catastrophe that it's creating, and late stage capitalism? Because like, I think what's scary about this moment is you're feeling like there's this visceral like scarcity and fear setting in inside of the United States, where people are very much like, what's mine? What do I have? What do I get? I don't want to be, there is this sort of ending of this kind of, or it's tightening. I don't know that there was ever this like abundance, like, generosity out of the mass American public, but there is this like, kind of constriction and an isolation that's taking hold, catalyzed by the rhetoric of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. That's coming with like, millions of people will have to leave where they live because it's not livable there anymore.
Yeah.
And in addition to then the ongoing like economic pressures and the sort of consequence of, the way that so much of the world has been subjected to the bullshit of, global capitalism, now neoliberalism, now turning into some other nasty thing that I don't know that there's a name for it yet. And so it feels like a train wreck, because it's like people are going to, and like any of us would. And so it is really, really scary. You've seen horrible images at the border, and I don't, and so yes, it's part of our, it's part of sort of the narrative and the story of what we understand, the assessment of what's happening. I also think it's important to say that there's also just the manifestation of climate catastrophe in the United States, most recently with the LA fires. So I think something really dope and interesting to look at is what the National Day Labor Organizing Network did with the mutual aid center and operations they created out of the Pasadena Job Center, where they're really kind of like positing that like immigrants will and you cannot rebuild Los Angeles without immigrant labor and the participation of immigrant people in the community. And so I think there's just stuff there, because it's like it's obviously happening across the globe, and that is going to be a major push factor, and I think will continue to kind of create these points of tension and crisis. But then internally to the United States, I think that example is like a beacon, I think, of one example of how to talk about and how to respond in a way that is like a salve to the feeling of isolation and sort of terror and like the scarcity and constriction that's making people turn to like a really shitty part of ourselves, right? In terms of the politics of now. So I think that's an important example. But yeah, I think it's gonna continue to be a huge factor.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Finally, I feel like I'd be remiss to not ask you, what is it that's keeping you going these days? Like, is there anything that you're like, what keeps you fired up?
I think political home. I think I used to say study. So I do think that study is still important, and being like, committed to revolutionary history, revolutionary practice, which I think in the end for me has been like not getting too bought into any which way about stuff, but to be able to understand myself as part of a lineage and trying to dar mi como granito de arena. That's historically been the case, but I think more and more as time goes on, I think it's crew. It's like the relationships, you know, the people that I've had the honor to work with at Mijente in particular, but even before, I think I think the possibility of things that we can do together and both the support and accountability, I think is a big part of it. But for sure, it's definitely really trying times and difficult times. And I think it's important to just say, like, we can talk about the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and what's good, what's not good, what's this and what's that. But I do think there is like just a recognition that part of the danger of this moment is that the old orders are dying.
Yeah.
And there isn't necessarily like a left alternative that is clear, and that compensates and acknowledges the mistakes of the past. Like, I think that's actually really important. And that is like rooted in kind of what's needed in a worldview and a vision. And I think basically need to be able to make sense to people, and that people can see a future for themselves, and not just like pretty language and theory from books. And so I don't know how that gets answered beyond just continuing to walk and continuing to acknowledge that that is a question, and remind, you know, and I kind of remind myself of this, like, I might be able to, you know, critique and talk shit about what I think is not going good and here and there, but it's also like, what you gonna do? What you know, what are, you know, what answers are we, what propositions are we developing by walking, you know, by just continuing to move? I don't know any other way, but I think it's important to acknowledge it, that there is this really significant question. I don't think it's just in the United States. I think it's global. And so that's why it's also so hard. And so I think the fact that we're still here, you know, trying, I think speaks a lot, but I think that's the challenge to us all.
Yeah, no, I feel that deeply. I think it's like, it's honestly one of the joys of being able to have folks like you on this show and like really dig deep on some of these things that are both, you know, we're thinking about the present, but we're also thinking about the like longer arc of history that we're a part of. It's really important. So yeah, thank you so much. Is there anything else? Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with? Any calls to action? Any other stuff that folks should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, just follow Mijente. We're gonna be fanning out, doing trainings and like holding kind of like circles of folks, you know, in practice to figure out how we, how we kind of like master, like really understand what they're doing to try to slow their asses down. And, you know, I know this is the block and build, but like the Contra Sin Deste is another framework that I think is very complementary to the block and build. So we can share that video. I think the sort of outside of the state work right now is going to be really, really important. We didn't get as much into it, but so much of the pathways we've traditionally understand to be able to make change are, you know, they've turned into obstacle courses and not pathways. And so sort of outside of the state, autonomous projects that are looking to solve problems for, you know, for all of us, I think are going to be really critical. So I can share that video in case folks are interested. And there's a lot of groups we've been able to work with that I think are worth like supporting and connecting to.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much. It's always a delight to talk to you.
Likewise.
Excellent. My thanks again to Sarah Lazar and also Marisa Franco for joining me today. We'll link to the relevant work in the show notes. You'll have access to all that stuff. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David is our production assistant. If you have something to say or a question about anything we talked about today, please do drop me a line. You can send an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.